Throughout time, fire has shaped western forests. In spite of that ancient reality, we see fire as a destroyer of trees. But a trip to Prim Meadow in western Montana is a trip back in time. It is a vision of the grand old ponderosa pine forests of long ago, a lure to Native Americans and homesteaders alike. A forest kept open by fire. The pines of Prim Meadow still stand in silent testimony to their ability to survive fire.
And we've hiked in here for years. Every year we made one trip in here. And we always thought, so gorgeous, it's like a cathedral. And every time we brought somebody new along, they agreed. They thought it was a marvelous place to be. I had never seen anything like it before. To see all those beautiful trees and the color of the trees and the golden look of the trees was so impressive.
This is a real special place because it's a forest like Lewis and Clark saw probably for dozens of miles in their travels in what is now western Montana. Lewis traveled up the Blackfoot Valley, and both of them traveled through a number of high valleys that would be real similar to this, that had these ponderosa pine forests like we have right here at Prim Meadow. And these were magnificent forests, these big old ponderosa pine, well spaced. And these kinds of forests are really rare now. This was the premier tree in the northern Rocky Mountains, being the premier lumber tree of the late 1800s. The whole forestry trade, the lumber trade, was all built on yellow pine. They were not interested in anything else. Eventually they could see that the big old yellow pine would be gone, and they would have to move to other species, Douglas fir and larch and so forth. But ponderosa pine just made beautiful lumber, and they use it for everything. Prim Meadow is an Indian encampment area, evidently. There's a number of Indian peeled trees here.
This is a nice area here, a camp area. And if they come here in the springtime, you never know. Some people might even stay here all winter. See, because when our people lived in the Bitterroot, they congregated by Stevensville, which is now Stevensville. They call that settlement to our people. Because I used to hear stories from the old people that in the spring, everybody scattered to their favorite haunts to spend the summer. They had to be here in the spring when the sap starts running in trees. Then the cambium layer is easy to peel. Yeah, this ponderosa pine, we're standing next to ponderosa pine as modern society calls it. It's satklp to our people, but it must be, I'd say, close to 400 years old. And when they wanted to get something to eat off of this tree, they had to peel the bark off, and you can see where they peeled it off. You can't see the original marks of how far back they peeled it, because the edges have grown over the original marks. But when they got the bark off, then the cambium, you can see the evidence of where the cambium layer was they started to peel that off. And when they got it down to here, they cut it off here. When they wanted to sweeten anything, they used something like this. They'd have a rack. Like when they dry meat, deer meat, elk meat, they have a drying rack, or fish, they have a drying rack. So maybe they just used that and put their cambium layer over that. No fire, of course, just to let it dry in the sun. After it was dried, they pounded it, made a powder out of it, and used that as a sweetener. they added to different berries or whatever they wanted to make sweet.
So this is a higher mountain setting, but it still has the open valley characteristics. So these were places that people have always enjoyed. Then the earliest settlers would identify these places, that is, pioneer people would find these kinds of places and file a homestead in the late 1800s and get maybe 160 acres of this and then try to make a living here. But they were farmers, and these places really couldn't be farmed. They're too frosty, they're too high elevation. Only the low elevation valleys are any good for farming, for growing any crops. So nearly all of these disappeared.
Well, the original homesteader on this place would have been Sam Parker's father, Frank. And he had homesteaded here in 1897. I assume it was one of those hard scrabble deals where they did a little bit of whatever. They probably maybe had a little bit of stock and did a little bit of trapping and a little bit of prospecting and just probably lived a pretty darn meager life with what little they scratched in. And probably lived a lifestyle where they didn't need to scratch very much in either. They had several little log cabins, just trappers' line shacks scattered up through the basin. And Frank would make a route that took him nearly a week on snowshoes to go from one cabin to the next, checking his trap line in the winter. Rumor is that he had a still at one point, and that's how he ended up losing the ranch, was in the financing of that.
Now we're sort of looking at a hillside over there, and if we go up there we can see that memorial that was placed to the two homesteaders that actually lived on this wonderful place. Frank Parker and his young wife, and they had 2 children, and then after that Charlie and Mahala Primm.
Well, I understand that Charlie was an engineer by trade. But like everything, some people have a specific aptitude, and he had to have had one for working with logs. And he had to have been an incredibly hard worker, because not only was he creating these buildings, but he was doing the work on a remote homestead.
I have never met the Primms, but some people I have met have actually visited her here. And the interesting part that they all say the same thing, that they were hunting or they were walking around, and she was always standing in front of the cabin with her gun, ready to defend herself.
Mahala worked as hard as Charlie at raking up the pine needles and clearing the stuff, because the pine needles are, of course, toxic to pregnant cows. They'll make them abort, so they had to remove the pine needles before they did any haying.
The homesteader here maintained it in a fairly open condition, didn't cut the big trees, but kept the little trees cut for in order to have pasture, which is what kept it in more of a natural condition.
Well, I know those ponderosas that we all admire now were a bone of contention, because as I said before, they had to rake up all the pine needles and maneuver around them, mowing that hay with a team of horses. And it had to have been an amazing challenge, to say the least. Anaconda owned the timber rights to them. So even though the Primms had the homestead, Anaconda had the timber.
We didn't own the land, and we wanted to buy the land because somebody in Missoula wanted to buy the land and subdivide it. They asked quite a bit of money, and I can't remember what it was, but it was very high per acre, cost per acre for the land. But we decided, well, we would call that the Director's Grove. So then I presented it to my boss in Stamford, Connecticut. He presented it to the CEO of the company, and he presented it to the board of directors to buy this Director's Grove, this big pine. I sent a picture back and everything, and they approved it. It's a beautiful setting, and when the cabins were there, it was really a pretty setting.
Having known Mihaela and Charlie and appreciated all the work that they had put in those buildings, you know, I wanted to preserve them. So I went to the bank and borrowed money and bought them. It's always bothered me that I took the buildings out of here. But seeing the fire and seeing the charred logs that remained from where the barn was, I guess maybe I feel pretty good, because probably the barn would have burned.
I heard the fire went through Gold Creek, and I had phone calls from friends. Everybody called me, said, you know, the fire went through your Primm Meadows. I said, oh no. And then it wasn't till later that they called back and said that they went in there, and after the fire was out, and they said, you know what, those famous trees didn't burn. I said, really? And they said, every other tree burned around in the neighborhood, but not this ponderosa pine. And so I was just, I mean, I just can't describe it, how excited I was over that news.
And so we were quite amazed that although we shouldn't have been, it came through as a fairly light surface fire, or very light surface fire, in this old growth stand, whereas all around it, it was quite severe burning. When it came in here to the park-like stand, it's like a pre-1900 condition. There's only the grass and the pine needles and bark flakes around the base of the trees, and so the fire just dropped down to the ground. There wasn't much to burn.
This is a great example of how the fire burned the needles and got really hot, and then started burning the tree, and it stopped right 5 inches above the ground, and the rest of it didn't burn. And it happened almost around every tree.
In time of Lewis and Clark, that's what happened, because the force that was shaping the forest more than anything was fires that were creeping along the ground, flames 2-3 feet high at the most, and that was killing the little trees, and the bigger trees were surviving. I mean, it was just part of the life of the explorers, of Lewis and Clark, and of the native people.
And on a good year, when there's a lot of grass, lightning hits on one end of this, it would take care of itself. That's why our old people always said, "Stiltla and Suwetchum" had a purpose. Thunder and lightning had a purpose.
Fire wasn't nearly as threatening as it is today, and sometimes you could walk across the burning line of fire. So they weren't the kind of crown fires that we're afraid of today and that are killing forests. There were some of those in the mountains, but not much where people were spending most of their time. Lewis and Clark saw 10 fires in the Rocky Mountain area during their trip. Of those 10, most of them, they were attributed to native people.
But our people didn't go around indiscriminately setting fires. They had a favorite place where the huckleberries were being forced out, then they'd set that afire to reestablish the huckleberries.
You know, deliberate burning to keep the forest open, that's nothing new. The native people at the time of Lewis and Clark, it's well known, would burn their campsites, often after leaving in the fall. They like to keep their camp areas especially open for a variety of reasons. That attracted the deer and the other game animals that they wanted to hunt. It provided forage by making a site real suitable for high nutrition type grass, not only for then the game, but also for the horses. And also it kept it open so that they could see if enemies were trying to sneak up on them. They had a good view, and yet there was a forest there, but they could see through it. It's a rarity to have a grove like this still standing. I mean, that's an understatement. There are groves of old growth pine today, but they have understory thickets beneath them that wouldn't have been there had fire carried on its natural role. The little thicket trees torch out and kill the bigger trees, and I've seen that kind of thing before, and it's pretty sad. So to see a forest that was managed lightly in a way that kept it open like a natural stand, and then to have the unrestrained wildfire come through, that was quite remarkable. This is like cranking the clock back 100 years and seeing what these forests were like. And they were just so hugely different than our modern forests. We need to start following nature's processes and using that as an example for our management. So this is a living embodiment of that here at Prim Meadow.
Well, I can't think of any other place near Missoula that has this type of timber. And I think it'll be an excellent place for people to come visit. And it's an excellent place to do a little research.
I just decided right from the beginning that this is something that we need to preserve for posterity. When you're here, you can just look around and you can walk around, and allows you to enjoy life.